everybody. Quite a few familiar names and some faces there on the screen. It's good to see those of you that have your gallery on. And welcome to this webinar. I'm going to share screen here and make a couple of kind of introductory comments and observations, and then leave the bulk of our time for Kristen's presentation, which I'll introduce in a little bit more detail when I get there. So let me hit this and get on to share the screen. There we go. Okay, why aren't we in the big view here? Well, let me see what's happening. Oh, sorry about that. I'm not able to.
Hi, Ron. Hi, Kristen.
Hello.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi.
Hello,
Hi, Leah.
Hi. Ron, maybe if you click on slideshow at the top.
At the top?
At the top bar.
Yeah. Resume, okay.
Resume.
We can still see your slides, Ron, if you, you could click right where you're at, or we can still see your slides in the window. So it's just that we're seeing them ahead of time.
Okay, well, again, I wanted to make a couple of kind of observations from 30,000 feet. In the organization development, management, leadership domain these days, there's quite a bit of focus on a whole bunch of things that begin with the phrase post-pandemic. And those of you familiar with Appreciative Inquiry, you can probably appreciate this dilemma that people tend to immediately kind of react to anything strength-based or anything that is supported by positive psychology as not conducive to this current context, that people are so traumatized and there is so much experience of pain, suffering, anxiety, stress, that it's just too far of a stretch to think about a strength-based approach in these times. So the first observation that I just want to throw out there is that David Cooperrider and I recently wrote an editorial, and basically we're saying that there's no better time. There's the call for appreciative inquiry, we think anyway, is greater than ever. Part of this has to do with that phrase post-pandemic. We believe that actually the signs of the times have been with us probably for at least a decade, that the nature of the environment that we find ourselves in our human systems, all of our human systems, more volatile, more complex, more uncertain, more ambiguous. I love this phrase, VUCA times. I think it's very descriptive. And what it calls into question is a whole lot of assumptions and even tools that we use in organization development that are based on theories and case studies and validation that was done mostly in the middle of the last century. Our primary change models are based on theories that were developed in the 40s and 50s. In the 1900s. And organizations in those days were facing, as you would agree, I think, very, very different times. You really could have a 10-year strategic plan. There was no such thing as the half-life of an IT innovation. Obviously, there was no social media. Our access to information was entirely different. There were no multicultural global companies. All those things that have changed over time have made the environment around organizations quite different. And most of our theories, as I said, are based on how do you produce routine, repetitive, at a standard work, products, services, and so forth. So organizations are built not to change, not to deal with these kinds of times. So how can we help organizations embrace more emergence, more complexity, more uncertainty? Most organizations fight to reduce uncertainty. And one thought or one observation I would share is that uncertainty is a given. We have to learn more. How do you lean into it? How do we accept and work within it? The things you read today about agile training, agile leadership, they begin to signal this kind of a direction, that we have to be more fluid, we have to be more flexible, and more rapid in adapting to things. But this idea of AI and the role or the place of appreciation and strength-based work amidst these VUCA times, it still kind of raises this dilemma, or what I was calling an oxymoron. There is so much negativity and so much real suffering that people are experiencing. How can you position appreciative inquiry to be a helpful resource? And for us, it starts with this notion that most people who resist or push back do so because they get hooked on the positivity versus negativity frame. So appreciative inquiry, as you know, as well as any strength-based approach, it focuses on what's working. It focuses on what's helping us be alive when we're most alive. And it does, at least temporarily, seem to ignore negativity or ignore the dark side, the deficit side, etc. It's not about positivity versus negativity or valuing one over the other. We need to transcend this frame. It really is about a choice. In the moment, what do you choose to focus on? And in appreciative inquiry, of course, we're focusing on what is giving life. That doesn't mean that certain things are not giving life or are detracting. It simply is a choice. What do we look for in this moment? Sorry. Oh, messed up. I'm having difficulty maneuvering here. Sorry. I put this book up by Viktor Frankl. Many of you have read things by him, you know about him. What he writes about over and over again is just this choice, this notion to choose to look into what's life-giving or not. And of course, in the horrific circumstances that he suffered through, he argues this is what kept him alive. This is what gave him hope amidst such tragic kinds of circumstances that are hard for most of us to actually imagine. So the task of appreciative inquiry is a search for what gives life, what fuels developmental potential, and what has deep meaning, even in the midst of tragic or suffering or trauma, those kinds of things. Again, it's not saying one is more real than the other. It's not saying that one is better than the other. There may well be times to choose to look at what is wrong and what is not giving life. But what we know about sustained change and transformation in organizations is that deficit focus doesn't sustain itself. What we have found with the strength-based focus is you can sustain positive change and transformation if and when you keep this focus on what is life-giving. In a different frame or a different way of saying it, Helen Keller, she acknowledges that the world is full of suffering and tragedy, but it's also full of overcoming it at the same time. So again, the focus, or I'm sorry, not the focus, the choice point is what's important. What do you choose to look at? In appreciative inquiry, we often say, the importance of topic choice is that whatever you choose to look at, you're going to find it. You're going to move in that direction. So again, it's our freedom of choice what to look at in these VUCA times. So there were two themes that Kristen and I wanted to simply headline today. She's going to take the second one here, inclusive workplace culture and inclusive leadership. Many, many organizations today near the top of their list of agenda is DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some have added the word belonging to that. But it's become more focal, more important. And I do think the pandemic and the social unrest during that pandemic and continuing has certainly amplified our attention to these kinds of issues. But the workplace has been disrupted, there's no question. And how organizations seek to move from that, whether they think about repairing it, going back to normal, or transforming it, this, I think, is a really shared issue or agenda for leaders today. The other one is post-traumatic growth. When David and I wrote our editorial and we were talking about the power of the questions you asked, I started to do some research and discovered this notion of post-traumatic growth. And I just wanted to share a few slides about it. So we all know about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. I think the research and the framing on that goes back almost to right at the end of the Vietnam War, in the US anyway. And it's a pretty common frame now. Lots of people refer to it. And we have, there's clinical diagnostic symptoms and measures and treatments. But it is clearly a focus in on the deficit, the focus in on a definition of the problem and how do we solve it, resolve it. There's also this notion of post-traumatic growth, it turns out. It's much newer. It was a phrase coined in the mid-90s. It's a positive psychological change in the wake of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. And to the extent that we share this post-pandemic frame and this idea of we've been through something everybody has been touched by and everybody has been disrupted by, it interested me. We've all struggled to some degree and continue to struggle in many cases, but we seldom do it with this frame of post-traumatic growth. It's diagnosable. It is a clinical measure now that people can study. The outcomes of post-traumatic growth include greater appreciation of life, more or deepening relationships with others, seeing new possibilities and opportunities, increased sense of personal strength, and spiritual enhancement. Many or all of these could also be hoped for outcomes of strength-based inquiry and strength-based change methods. So that also interested me, that there seemed to be an overlap. And then I found this. Post-traumatic growth is natural. It's inherent. It's as inherent or even more inherent than post-traumatic stress. 50 to 70% of adults are estimated to naturally experience post-traumatic growth out of traumatic experiences. In addition, they have found certain things help people through this more rapidly, or just simply more people who are in a traumatic or stressful state. And of the 5 things listed there, the one that jumped out to me was this narrative development. Helping to produce an authentic narrative about the trauma and our lives afterwards so that we can accept the chapters already written and imagine crafting the next ones in a meaningful way. Your story and the stories of people you're helping can and should be about a traumatic past that leads to a better future. When you think of appreciative inquiry and the emphasis we put on stories and the power of stories to connect people, to create a collaborative orientation, and then this just seems to underscore it even more. But what it does suggest is that we welcome stories that include trauma. We welcome stories that include perhaps suffering or pain or real obstacles that were overcome, that became learning experiences, that became transformational moments in retrospect. And sometimes people haven't written that part of their story yet. You know, they're as this suggests in the metaphor, they're still in the early chapters. So how might we help people build this narrative of growth? So again, using the power of questions, it just left me with different types of questions to open or to be conversation starters with people who are experiencing trauma or are suffering or are visibly still disrupted in their lives, whether or not they attribute it directly to the pandemic or to social unrest here in our culture. So how might we catalyze, foster, or expand post-traumatic growth in these challenging times? What new questions might we offer up to create generative conversations with anyone in crisis? What questions would help re-narrate a story of resilience and recovery? Imagine you're with someone who's in the midst of a trauma. What AI questions could you offer up to hasten or support what Helen Keller calls the overcoming of it? So the piece here that I wanted to just flag and frame a little bit is this reframing of a dominant narrative out there. Partly the narrative that everything was due to the pandemic, but also the narrative that there's been trauma, and so it's all about post-traumatic stress. There is such a thing as post-traumatic growth. It's probably larger and more frequent than we even notice because we don't ask that question or frame it in those terms. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing here in just a minute, but I want to make a transition. So co-presenter today, Kristen Bishop, as Suzanne introduced earlier, she's a very recent graduate of our Master's in Positive OD program. And Kristen did what we call a mastery learning project. She chose an area which had to do with strength-based change and whole system change using appreciative inquiry. And she completed her mastery project with Dealer Tire. And so that's the story that she's going to share related to this other big theme that I think is surfacing everywhere under the acronym of DEI or DEI and belonging, and how that calls for a different kind of inclusive leadership and inclusive workplaces. So Kristen, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Ron. And nice to see some new faces and some familiar faces today, but appreciate everyone's time in taking an hour out of your day to join us. But as Ron said, I'm going to be talking about appreciative inquiry to yield inclusive leadership through sharing a case story of my work with Dealer Tire. I was privileged to be able to partner with them in the last semester of my MPOD program and both shadow and assist on what ended up being a year-long initiative for them that has really been championed within their organization. So excited to share some of this with you all today. So what I'll be reviewing in the next 15 minutes or so is who Dealer Tire is and their inclusive leadership objectives, why appreciative inquiry was the right choice for them, how we tailored this approach, some of our key findings, and then impact and reflections, both for how Dealer Tire has leveraged this work and reflections on appreciative inquiry in general that you all can take into your own workplace, into your own practice. I know some of you, appreciative inquiry is old hat and you're very familiar and well seasoned, and others that might be a little newer. So hopefully you'll have something that you can take away. And for the sake of time and just managing technology, if there's any questions, feel free to hold those to the end, but you can also type them into the chat if you're afraid you're going to lose them. And then Ron and I will both be facilitating that conversation at the end and can address them. Also, just want to confirm before I move forward that you all can see my screen and that it's in the correct full screen view.
It is, yeah.
Great, wonderful. All righty. So a little background on Dealer Tire as a company and what their objectives were first. So they're a B2B organization in Cleveland that really revolutionized the way people buy tires and care for their cars. They provide different types of industry support to top auto brands like Toyota and Lexus and many others that you're all familiar with to help them grow their tire and light business. They've been around for over 100 years. They're family owned and operated. If you live in the Cleveland area, you're probably familiar with them. And they have about 1,500 employees. So just a quick snapshot for those of you who are not familiar with them as a company. And there's a few reasons why they realized there's a need for an inclusive leadership initiative a couple years ago. First, there was an opportunity to upgrade and update their leadership competencies and expectations to reflect the needs of employees, as well as aspects of leadership that are now considered critical within organizations. So things like psychological safety and inclusion, that are really important to have within organizational culture, but maybe weren't part of the conversation about 10 years ago. They also realized that inclusion needs to be modeled by the highest levels of the organization and really be embedded into organizational structure and roles and rewards. So there needs to be a link between inclusion and leadership. You can't have one without starting with leadership and starting with modeling it at the top. And they had an inclusion council, but they had yet to have an initiative around inclusion outside of the council that really spanned the full organization. So there was a need for that at the time as well. And while employee engagement is generally high, Dealer Tire is consistently awarded top workplace in the area. Data at the time did suggest some lower inclusion scores for female employees as well as employees of color. So they sought to have high employee engagement and satisfaction with no variation in score across gender, across race, across rank and level in the organization. Happily, for multiple different reasons, this variance actually wasn't the case in their most recent employee survey. So they're already making some great strides in this direction. And Dealer Tire also helps socialize the need for this initiative internally, both through looking at its own data and needs, but also looking to some external sources that show that inclusive leadership is the right thing to do, both for an organization's people and for its business and bottom line. So I won't read all of these stats. These are provided by Dealer Tire. And for those of you who do work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, you're probably familiar with some of these and have multiple that you could add. But for example, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusive efforts, a McKinsey study last year found that companies that incorporate diversity and inclusion initiatives see 22% less turnover. So this, of course, points to more engaged employees, also more stability for the company. So really looking at the organization through inclusive leadership being the right thing to do for their employees and their culture, and also for their business. All of this then led to the guiding question of what is inclusive leadership and how can it be enhanced individually and collectively at Dealer Tire? So to that end, the objectives that the team articulated were to develop shared, deeper understanding of inclusive leadership, the value it brings and the impact to Dealer Tire, to clarify the elements of inclusive leadership and how to develop and support them within the organization, and to build internal capacity for leading complex conversations and developing actionable opportunities, all in service of that North Star vision statement that I just reviewed. So this leads us to how they sought to accomplish those goals, kind of what was the general approach, the methodology. Of course, spoiler alert, it was Appreciative Inquiry, but I wanted to kind of cover why that was and how we adjusted it to fit their culture. And before we get into that approach, I would love to ground this in what inclusion means to all of you, because that kind of helps paint the picture for why we chose Appreciative Inquiry in the first place. So I'd appreciate if everyone could go into the chat box and just type one word that you would use to describe how being included at work makes you feel. I'm not going to call on anyone. I know that this can be, vulnerable. So no one's going to be called on to explain their word or tell their story. Just want to hear what some of those words are, if you can type them into the chat box. Yes, a lot of valued. Oh, agency, that's an interesting one. Belonging. Appreciated, empowered. Alyssa, yes, heard, love that one. More empowered. Oh, trusted, yes, that's a good one. Wonderful, yeah, you can see how if you scroll up, kind of the commonality and the themes that pop with some variance as well. But this exercise that you just did, as brief and short and simple as it was, really showcases some of the reasons why we used Appreciative Inquiry in the first place. It's participatory, it involved the whole system, it involved all of you all. It opens minds up to possibilities, it isolates what's working well, it's grounded in your own experiences, it's grounded in your perspective. So it was the core methodology that we utilized for those reasons, and also because the team realized that they needed a change intervention methodology because creating an inclusive culture requires an initiative where the full organization is collaborating and contributing to that effort versus something that's more passive. So the book Organization Development Interventions captures this well in saying too many people who have been tasked to formulate and implement diversity, inclusion, and equity programs and organizations have had limited success. One reason is that these efforts are not always regarded as OD interventions. Rather, many are treated as training interventions. It is not possible to change an organization on training alone. This is particularly relevant, I feel like, in the space of DEI, as it used to be, if you remember working, 10, 15 years ago, that there would be diversity training or inclusion training. And of course, now we know that that's not the correct way to go about creating inclusive cultures. You can't train your way into a better, healthier culture. So you really need an intervention that involves the full system, and that is a change intervention versus anything that is focused around just training. So it was also the appropriate choice because, of course, Appreciative Inquiry focuses on what's already working well within the organization that can be replicated versus that deficit-based approach. We're looking at the organization when it's most alive, most effective, and most constructively capable in economic, ecological, and human terms. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with Appreciative Inquiry, we're looking to move through the 4D cycle of methodology, starting with discovery of illuminating what's already working, dream, the overall vision, design options to make it happen, and delivery, the action planning. And this is all underscored by the positive core of what inclusion at Dealer Tire is really all about at its best. And the vision that shaped the process and shaped the interview guide that I'll also walk through here in a moment was the Inclusion Council's vision of being committed to creating an environment of diversity, inclusion, equality, and continuous growth for our associates, customers, and stakeholders. So this really served as the strategic North Star for the whole initiative. And I would highly recommend having your own vision statement guiding any large change initiative and just returning to this. It's really a helpful strategic tool to ask yourself, is the discussion guide, strategically in the right direction? And are the initiatives strategically in the right direction? And just return to this and kind of check this. So these items are the vision and the approach that really shaped that process to undertake the full initiative. And then from here, the process was tailored to really make it work for Dealer Tire. So of course, it generally follows appreciative inquiry, both in flow and approach and kind of the spirit of AI, but we had to make it work for the culture within Dealer Tire. So through a 6-month process earlier this year, they partnered with myself as well as a couple of other appreciative inquiry experts to develop objectives and questionnaires and work on the internal communications to really build understanding and enthusiasm around the effort. They then conducted appreciative inquiry style conversations with over 200 associates, either through one-on-one conversations or through small group conversations that kind of acted as appreciative inquiry style focus groups. And I had the opportunity to conduct some of these interviews myself, as well as shadow one of those groups. And then as a nod to the industry that Dealer Tire operates in and reflect kind of that internal lexicon, these sessions were referred to as coil sessions, since that's an automotive term. So you'll see that term coil and coil design kind of pop up. So just wanted to kind of ground everyone in why that is. And then from there, the team synthesized and prioritized all the feedback from what they heard from these associates. This was a really highly participatory process. We had associates who were assigned to be synthesizers. We had associates who were assigned to be active listeners, to be readers, to be interviewers. So really involving the full organization and understanding the themes that were emerging about what inclusivity is at its best within this culture. And then lastly, the team leveraged the totality of all this work and the synthesized findings to really develop a DEI roadmap. So I'm going to walk you through some of those findings and some of those implications. But first, as a peek behind the scenes and to kind of frame up the findings, I wanted to share our Appreciative Inquiry questionnaire. So again, this is designed, of course, to inform what's working well within inclusivity in the culture today and some of those generative opportunities for improvement. As Ron said earlier, Appreciative Inquiry isn't just about positivity. There's, of course, opportunities to speak toward what could be better and what are some of those generative opportunities as well. So the first question is a scenario to illustrate inclusion at its best. And importantly, it's grounded in narrative. Reflecting on your past experiences, think of a time when you felt especially included at work. What specifically did that experience look and feel like to you? So we had individuals recall a specific moment and describe that both in scenario and in feeling and kind of what emotions that brought up for them. The second question then was specific to what is currently working well within the organization. So from your perspective and with that experience in mind, what is Dealer Tire currently doing to foster an inclusive organization? In what ways do you feel Dealer Tire is making strides toward a more inclusive organization? So we want to understand what's already working well that we don't want to lose, since any part of a change initiative isn't just what to change, but what do we have to fight to retain and what do we have to make sure we don't give up? Question 3 then is about imagining an ideal future. So we asked participants to imagine that it's 5 years from now and Dealer Tire has been recognized as an organizational leader in workplace inclusion. What has happened to make you feel this reputation is authentic? So we wanted to understand kind of what that gap is between the current reality and the future reality, but in a way that focused on what it could be versus the pain points. Though this was an interesting and a helpful opportunity to bring up some of that more constructive space for improvement as well. And then lastly, short and sweet discussion guide number 4 was reflecting on your images from the previous question. What are 1 to 2 small actions that you could take personally to help foster a more inclusive workplace for others? So this one was helpful in us building our action planning together, in involving associates and brainstorming, also just to kind of get shared enthusiasm and shared accountability within the culture, just by nature of them thinking about this question and being asked this question. So that brings us to our findings. I'll just share a quick glimpse of some of these findings. I thought it'd be helpful to share these out in an Appreciative Inquiry style SOAR framework. For those of you not familiar, this was developed by Jackie Stavros. It stands for Strengths, Opportunities, Aspirations, and Results. So it's the appreciative model that stands in contrast to the common SWOT analysis that eliminates weaknesses and threats, but instead wants to focus on future vision and strengths. So I'll share this out in a narrative approach of a couple quotes we heard from the associates, bringing to life the different quadrants that you see here. For strengths, we heard things like, I truly feel like everyone has a voice. People have created an environment of transparency where you can share. It feels like a safe space to share and to be, regardless of what your thought is, positive or negative. So you hear kind of the strength of psychological safety in that quote. We heard we get birthday cards from the company every year. And this is a scenario that actually came up again and again. It's a personal note specific to me, a handwritten card. Those things make me feel included. The hierarchy is up a couple levels, but they see me. So feeling seen and valued is really themes that emerge from this second quote. And like I said, the scenario came up multiple times, which is really telling. From an opportunity perspective, just a couple snippet examples, we heard things like Dealer Tire can embrace people and not enforce this hyper-professional experience. From a culture standpoint, if we say show up as your authentic self, we can't define for people what authentic is. So the opportunity here to model the culture we want to see and make sure we're practicing what we say. We also heard, I think we could have more investment in people's professional and personal development, offering mental health support, more time off. We can give associates more freedom. So you see the imperative of investing in associates and giving more flexibility. This directly comes into play with one of the strategic actions that the team is taking since this work, which I will get to as well. From an aspirations perspective, we heard future visions like an inclusive leader challenges themselves and their own beliefs. They ask themselves questions on why they do or do not do something, why they believe something. You need to be brave enough to really look at yourself and realize where you're flawed. Only then can you become a better leader. So speaking to how leaders really need to challenge and push themselves, and they need to question themselves and really strive to be better. We heard inclusion at its best means I see a culture where people feel comfortable expressing opinions, even if they're not popular, they feel safe. So again, speaking to that psychological safety and safety from a fear of repercussions. So what this led to then is a vision of the positive core of inclusive leadership within Dealer Tire through a synthesis process. This is a visual representation of all the core themes that we heard and some of the supporting actions and structures. The team thought it was helpful to have this in a visually evocative way to spark brainstorming versus just in words or just in data points. A professional artist rendered this, so I can't take credit, Dealer Tire can't take credit, but highly recommend bringing in some kind of visual synthesis into your change initiative. I think it created a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm at a part of the process that can feel really heavy when you're starting to translate into action. But you can see some of the main themes here, like everyone at the table and empower, authentic. You see diversity of thought and belonging. And then under supporting actions and structures on the right, we have the imperatives that the team used to spark action planning. So those were things like empowering others, personalized experience, and investing in associates. So these supporting actions and structures were really the jumping off points for all of the action planning. So the summary of these findings was that inclusive leadership at Dealer Tire at its best is behaviors that help employees feel seen, known, and appreciated, which is interesting because those are some exact words that you all used when I asked what inclusion means and feels like to you all. So some kind of universal themes and universal experiences there. Behaviors that demonstrate an egalitarian culture, being asked to join cross-functional teams or moments when they're recognized within teams or recognized individually for their contribution within teams, the ability to share feedback freely without fears of repercussions, diversity of leaders and mentors at all levels, knowing how people want to be communicated to and showing people that they are uniquely valued, soliciting employee feedback and then actually taking action on it. We heard particularly the latter is rare in many organizations and Dealer Tire does it well. And an open book philosophy where people are comfortable partnering with leaders, allowing for psychological safety. So that takes us through all the SOAR aspects other than results. These are some of the ways that Dealer Tire was striving to kind of measure success when they asked themselves, how will we know that we've made strides in progress in this initiative? So some of these are external metrics, some internal, some qualitative, some quantitative. It was really helpful to have a blend of all of those metrics to look at success holistically. So from an external perspective, they're part of the Greater Cleveland Partnership and they're looking at their D&I assessment. Internally, they're looking at increased employee engagement scores and no variation in things like gender and race and level. and then qualitative analysis such as recognition stories and employee spotlights, feedback that they get from employees, feedback that they get from the Inclusion Council, and hiring parity. So lastly, just want to share a few next steps for Dealer Tire, some key learnings for me that hopefully will be helpful in change initiatives that you're all leading or hoping to lead. So what Dealer Tire did out of all of this work is develop 5 core strategic focus areas that were based on the Appreciative Inquiry findings and that visual synthesis. And these are the areas that they linked specific tactics and action to. So we have investing in associates, personalized experience, empowering each other, open communication, and driving our culture. And then they have a full grid of specific tactics that accompanied each focus area. Of course, some of that is proprietary, so won't completely screen share that here. But as a couple examples, one action that they're taking is conducting a full benefits audit and providing recommendations on next steps, looking at things like their parental leave, PTO, and family building. Another item is creating more communication and transparency around pay practices in order to enhance equity of pay across every level. And then most importantly, this initiative has been referenced so many times in meetings and their own engagement survey and conversations in hallways and on Zoom as an example of inclusion. Employees said that they felt heard, they felt valued, they loved being a part of this, they loved being invited into it. They hope to have more sessions like this. So the initiative itself has really created impact just in its existence. And then lastly, my key learnings and kind of what I'm doing with Appreciative Inquiry now. Then after that, Ron and I can open it up to any questions. Some main takeaways was first to involve employees, to use a train the trainer approach for these one-on-one interviews, have employees conduct the interviews themselves, and then create tailored roles for them. Like I said, we had people who were active listeners, who were synthesizers, who were note takers, but people tend to really deeply commit to and champion initiatives that they help build. And this is something that, while I knew it in theory, I really appreciated how deeply Dealer Tire kind of adheres to that and applies it in a long-term initiative like this. Second, tailor the approach to the organization. So mirror the lexicon of the organization, invite multiple ways for employees to participate, ensure organizational elements can support the desired change. As a quick example here, there was a time this past winter when the Omicron variant was putting a pause to back to work programs, and it was creating a lot of uncertainty within Dealer Tire's culture. So the core team made the wise call to loosen the timeline of this initiative so that it wouldn't be too much change at once. So they were thinking holistically about how much change can the organization sustain and how should we sequence that change, how much change is too much, and thinking about it through that holistic lens. Third, intentionally, develop internal communications. So think about the story you're trying to tell the organization and how you will bring them along that story. This was a huge part of what we did. We communicated, and we thought we over communicated, and it still wasn't enough. But we were always thinking about what's the story that the people leaders need to know, and what about senior leaders, and what about the core team, and how are we crafting that story to bring everyone along and to create shared enthusiasm. And then lastly, build a core steering committee for Dealer Tire. Obviously, this was the Inclusion Council, which represented a cross-functional team to really champion the initiative. But with any change initiative, you can create your own cross-functional core team. It's also critically important for someone from senior leadership to be part of this team and to really be championing the initiative throughout its entirety. And what's next for me personally, kind of post this initiative, how I've been applying Appreciative Inquiry in my role since completing the MPOD program just a few months ago. So I work at Brand Trust, which is a consultancy that leverages Appreciative Inquiry and other methodologies to understand kind of the deep human stories and truths that make up an organization. So I found Appreciative Inquiry really helpful in helping organizations uncover and leverage their strengths, their strongest assets, the most effective aspects of their culture, to build brand strategies from a place of strength in order to inform brand purposes and promises that are both authentic and inspirational, and to take a strengths-based approach to change enablement. So the initiative with Dealer Tire was really helpful toward these applications. So I was grateful to be able to be brought along in the past year or so of their journey. So with that, wanted to thank you all for your time today. Ron and I will go ahead and open it up to any questions in our last 10 minutes or so. You can also email me here if there's a question that you don't get to or is a little bit more specific, but I will go ahead and end the show and go off screen share so we can see all of you.
Thank you, Kristen. Great job. There's a couple of immediate questions in the chat, and then I see hands starting to go up. So let's see, let's go up to, there's a question. I think the first question is about were the interviews done virtually and in person or all in person, the focus groups?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. They were all done virtually. Originally, they were going to be in person, and then when the Omicron variant started, we realized they needed to be virtually. We did tailor them. Of course, we had to for the group focus. For individual, it could just be a phone call or a one-on-one Zoom. For the ones that were more focus groups, we introduced an icebreaker exercise. We had people go off into breakout teams to talk about their personal experiences in a smaller format so that they weren't sharing personal stories with a group of 10 people. It was groups of 1 or 2. And then we gave them instructions on what to take notes on, what to share back in the main team. And we also had a co-facilitator who was able to capture notes so that the main facilitator could really stay engaged in the conversation. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what this looks like in a group format, what it looks like in a virtual format, and kind of what technology to use for that too.
You see, can you read Andy Peck's question? If not, Andy, why don't you just come on and give it aloud?
Yeah, hello, everyone. Great to see you. Great presentation, Ron. Nice to see you as well. I was just curious, to what extent did you also look at factors of productivity and innovation? To what it looked like the emphasis was on culture and workforce issues. Did you look at or establish any kind of metrics around how it improved the overall sort of business results? Thank you.
Great question. Yes, it was mostly focused internally, culturally on workforce areas. The employee engagement data does also capture things like productivity and capture things like innovation. So one of the criteria for success was, do we see an overall score in that data versus just in inclusive data? So it's captured indirectly in that way, but the initiative as a whole was focused internally on culture versus more external factors like productivity.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Janelle, you want to bring yours? Just speak up.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just curious what executive sponsorship looked like. How was the CEO and the rest of the C-suite involved in this initiative?
Yeah, we had a member of the C-suite on the core steering committee on that inclusion council, which served as the core team. And that was incredibly useful to be able to have, his buy-in and involvement and participation, not just from a high level, but really being part of the work and doing the work. And then I'm not privy to, kind of his relationship with the CEO and how often they meet, but I do know that, of course, there's leadership team meetings where they fill each other in on these initiatives so that the CEO was aware of it as well. But we did have a C-suite member on the core team, which was incredibly helpful.
Well, thank you.
Rich? Rich Johnson, are you still there?
Yes, I am. There you go.
Yeah. Go ahead with your question.
Oh, no, I was just interested in if they did any overall calculation of what their overall diversity numbers are right now at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have to go to my contacts at Dealer Tire to get those for you, since I don't work directly with them. I don't want to say something that is incorrect or outdated. But if you want to send me a direct message with your email, I'm happy to reach out to my contacts and get that to you.
Okay.
Great. Any others? Okay, well, there's a minute or two left. If it comes up, please speak up. Kristen, I have one. I'm always curious about focus groups versus the one-on-one, the more traditional one-on-one appreciative inquiry interviews, we call them. They're, really story sharing. what did you learn or notice about people, any tendency for people, if they don't go first in a focus group, to mimic or copy what's already been said? Or to put it a different way, did you notice any helpful hints about making sure that everybody is more spontaneous in their own story?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we did some kind of little things to mitigate groupthink. Like at the very beginning, when we had an icebreaker exercise, the same one I did with you all, to insert a word about what being included or how being included makes you feel. We asked them to all press enter at the same time, so they weren't able to see the words that other people were entering. It was just, blind enter, and then you see it all at once. So that helps mitigate, like, oh, I see everyone saying valued, I guess that's the right answer. So there were just like little tweaks like that. Other times we would tell them to, imagine the scenario and jot down an answer individually and then share that out. So then they were more likely to commit to what they jotted down individually versus just speaking out loud, as well as going into the like very small groups or pairs instead of speaking in a large team. So it's never like a perfect science. Like in any group, you're going to have, social norming going on, but we did try to mitigate that through some of those tips.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else from anybody else?
A quick question, Ron. I know since I came through MPOD 8 in 2013, from what you're saying now and saying let's incorporate some of the negative, is that kind of a paradigm shift now that AI is willing to take and say, hey, there are going to be sometimes negative, less positive stories, and we need to find a way to be able to actually deal with that?
I wouldn't quite say it that way, Rich. What I've started to do is change the way I ask the question for a story or the probes into that story to make sure that people can talk about hurdles that they overcame, crises or unexpected issues that they had to deal with. Mm-hmm. But it's not saying, well, I want you to talk about the negatives. It's about I want you to talk about resilience.
And I guess I would say that not saying I want you to talk about it, but at the same time, I won't be dismissive of it.
Right, but it doesn't start with tell me about the time when you were feeling the most stressed, that kind of thing.
Right. I think of the folks that just endured the hurricane in Florida, Fort Myers, having maybe their home washed away. It might be difficult at first to have a positive discussion with them if I'm not willing to first maybe listen to some of their pain points that they may be experiencing.
Yes, and there's a way, I think, to frame a story or a question for a story that includes the pain, but doesn't necessarily begin with it.
Okay, gotcha.
And that, I mean, this is the, what did I say? The messiness, the complexity of working in these times, I think. But again, it's not positive versus negative. It's about how can we invite narratives that are about overcoming or are about growing and learning from and through trauma. Okay, great. We have just a minute left, and in the spirit of celebrating some of our alums and their work, Diana, are you still on? I can't see on my.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry for the background noise.
You have a free PR spot here for your seminar tomorrow. Tomorrow is homecoming, or this is homecoming weekend at Case Western, and there are lots of different activities, webinars, hybrid sessions going on. Diana is going to be hosting one, and it will include a panelist from Dealer Tire as well. So you want to give a little pitch?
Sure, and I apologize for the background noise. I'm at the Delta Sky Club about to board a flight to come to Cleveland. And our panel tomorrow at 4:15 in the Peter B. Lewis building is on leading in this new world of work. So we do have Jennifer Johnson from Dealer Tire as one of our panelists. We have a CEO and CFO from a more entrepreneurial company, Vimby. And then we have a senior leader at Morgan Stanley. So we have a different kinds of groups from national, international to entrepreneurial. And this is a terrific time for this topic because now I have more in-depth information about questions I can ask Jen and others about this topic. Kristen, you did an absolutely amazing job. And Ron, it's always a pleasure to see you. Oh, good. And the room may be filled tomorrow for the 4:15 session, and you may not be on campus, but you can always sign up virtually if you would like to see it. And feel free to post some questions.
Are you able, where you are right now, to put a link for the registration for the virtual?
I don't have that handy.
I registered yesterday, but I didn't keep the link, I don't think.
Let me see if
maybe it's on my calendar. Maybe it's on my calendar. Okay, I know we're up against time here for people. Thank you again for coming. It's great to see the names and some of the faces. If some of you want to hang on for a second, I'll see if I can get that link for tomorrow's seminar as well and put it on the chat. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thank you
day.
all. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kristen.
Bye-bye.